I'm really excited about tonight's stream. This is something I'm extremely passionate about, watering. You guys are in the workshop because so much of what we need to talk about is going to be a board discussion, and then and we've got some cool clips for you guys where there's just some ongoing application of the knowledge that we're going to lay down. Let's dive in. And the focus here when we're talking today in particular is spring watering. And there's a very big difference when we start talking about seasonality of watering application. Everybody says watering is so important. Why don't more professionals teach watering? And I've asked myself that a lot. And the question is, how do you teach watering, right? Because teaching watering for me in Japan was watching Mr. Kimura water and making sure the hose didn't kink, and inside of that, kind of following his thought process through that whole thing. We've done some of that for you guys. But first of all, I think we've got to have a really solid understanding of what we're trying to accomplish and the things that water is contributing to at this time of year, okay? So just in terms of general watering concepts, all right? When we start to talk about general, these are the must-know for watering, general watering concepts. Number one, so these are big round figures that I'm going to give you guys, but it's important that you have a fundamental foundation for water's utilization inside a tree. And I always like to think about water as a vehicle, right? So if we think about water, H2O, and we think about water as a vehicle, you have to ask yourself, what is water transporting, right? And the major thing that water transports is heat. So we talk about water in terms of its ability to cool the tree. This is almost like a swamp cooler, or like an air conditioner. So you have a sedentary tree that can't physically get out of the heat, the intense sun, etc. Like we have mobility, trees don't, okay? So if they're going to be able to continue to metabolize and photosynthesize and do all these things when it's really, really hot, they've got to have a way to cool down their system so that their structure, the leaves, the branches, the tissue, doesn't burn, doesn't degrade, doesn't decay, okay? And this is what water's function inside of this system is. So if we look at our tree here, okay, and again, anybody who studies at Mirai knows that my drawings are amazing, okay, and I'm
gotta
sharing
have the smiley face.
They gotta have, this is a happy tree. This is a healthy, happy tree.
This tree got watered.
This tree got watered, that's what I'm saying. And then this Mr. Sunshine is always pretty happy, okay? So when this is happening, right, we have a lot of transpiration at the foliar level. So when we look here, and we'll just break this down into, this can even be a happy leaf, okay? And at this happy leaf, we're having constant evaporation of water molecules from the leaf surface, okay? Now, whether this is a conifer, whether this is a deciduous, whether this is a broadleaf evergreen, whether it's a tropical, it works the same, okay? Water is evaporating from the leaf surface. Now, if we look at the bottom, and let's just pretend that Mr. Happy Leaf, we're going to take this off, we're going to flip him over, this is his backside. We've got these little holes on the bottom of the leaf, okay? Those holes are called stomata. Stomata, okay? Stomata are the holes where gaseous exchange is taking place. Carbon dioxide is coming in, oxygen is leaving. And this is where we say trees make oxygen. That's amazing, okay? That process is very sophisticated. Carbon dioxide comes in, oxygen leaves, okay? Just keep that in mind. So through that stomata, this is where water is evaporating. And we call the evaporation of water in a tree transpiration. We break that down, it's literally the same thing that we do as human beings in terms of sweating, okay? So these water molecules are attached to each other. They have a very, very strong bond, molecule to molecule, water does. And they form a chain. And this chain flows all the way down through the root system, okay? All the way down to the tips of these finer roots, and it even flows outside of the root and into the soil mass, still maintaining cohesion between the water molecules, okay? So when this water molecule turns into gas, right, that applies tension on that chain because it's saying, I'm going, right? And then that next water molecule is pulled into that place, and it's like, no. And then the next one is, yeah. And it's just this continual process that puts this tension on this chain, okay? This theory, cohesion, tension, theory. Okay, this is your fundamental building block of how water is moved through what we would call an advanced plant system, or for us, a tree, okay? This is the fundamental thought process that allows water movement to defy gravity and reach such heights. Now, when we get to something like a redwood, that changes a little bit. The canopy of the tree, different structure than the lower portion because we get to a point where it can't raise that water against gravity just via the tension on that chain. We're not going to talk about that right now, okay? So cohesion tension theory, evaporation is taking place. Now, when that molecule is moving through this system, water, as a fundamental resource, has an extremely high heat retention capacity. Okay, let's go back to that. Water, as a fundamental element, high heat retention capacity, which means as a molecule, it's able to bind and hold heat for a prolonged period of time. So as it's moving through this system, you have all of this heat accumulating. Those water molecules are grabbing onto that warmth, and they're carrying it through the tree. When they evaporate, that energy, that is that heat, is also released. And this is what forms the cooling cycle for a tree. Okay? So this is a very interesting thing. When we say number one function is cooling, we could very easily say and very safely say 85% of all water is for air conditioning alone. Right? Now, if I'm assuming if I asked you guys what is watering used for, most of us would say transport, okay, as a vehicle. But I doubt we would have said transport of heat. I bet we would have thought transport of molecules or transport of nutrition, right? Or transport of sugars or carbohydrates, okay, which is totally different, entirely different system, okay? Now, inside of that, when we talk about it being a vehicle, okay, we've also got to think about water as a mechanism that allows gaseous exchange. Okay? Allows gaseous exchange. Now you may be saying, well, how? I understand water turns into gas, but how does water allow gaseous exchange to take place in a tree? Well, there's something interesting inside of this stomata, right? We've got these very interesting, it's almost like, clowns at a kid's birthday party that create balloon animals. That's what these things look like, okay? Now this is the stomata, this is the hole, and this is the opening, all right? And these cells that exist around that are filled with water. When they're filled with water, it causes them to bend. And when they're bent, this hole is open, the stomata is open. Now, while that stomata is open, there's a free exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide passing in and out, as well as other gaseous elements in the atmosphere, nitrogen being one of them, okay? But we've got the in and out of CO2 and oxygen taking place here. When this tree starts to experience water shortage in the roots, or when we see the roots take on damage, that would impair their ability to deliver water, which from overwatering, we can see this happening, right? We see damage in the roots, maybe too much heat with too much water caused a condition that broke down the organic matter or the organic components in the soil. Maybe we saw too much dryness cause the roots to completely desiccate and die, and now we don't have our water transport capacity. Or, a lot of times when we start to see too much salt accumulating in the container, it's competing with that water uptake ability in the root system, and all of a sudden we start to see this turgid pressure, okay? We call this turgid pressure. We see turgid pressure or water content inside of the cell start to drop, okay? As that turgid pressure starts to drop, what happens is your balloon animals, they start to lose their turgidity. They start to lose the flex that keeps that stomata very wide open. And as that continues to progress, they eventually close. Now, if you think about this mechanism, the tree is basically saying, listen, I'm going to get real hot, but I would rather be hot and risk heat breaking down my system than lose all of my water and completely shut down or completely desiccate entirely, right? Because now when they're closed, we're at a very water minimal state. And the tree is saying, I'm trying to conserve. I don't want water transpiring or evaporating anymore. I'm trying to conserve all of my resources. I'm going to close it down. But this means nothing's taking the heat out of the system. And this also means that photosynthesis is shutting down, right? Because now we don't have carbon dioxide moving in and oxygen moving out, okay? So when we start to talk about allows gaseous exchange, this is one of the biggies in wintertime. right? Where we have a frozen root system, we have a high wind situation, we're saying 85% contributes to cooling, but what about those winter situations? Well, this is one of those things where when that starts to lose too much water, everything starts to shut down, right? Very fundamental aspect of plant growth in terms of those stomatal openings on the bottom or on the sides of your needle mass or leaves, okay? Number 3, fundamental aspects of watering. Plant material generation. Okay, so we could call this photosynthetic mass. So when we start to talk about what is it that actually creates that physical leaf, right? That physical leaf is created by cellular division. What drives cellular division? Sugars and carbohydrates, or energy. What creates that energy? Well, let's take a look at that. Energy, in its basic form for a plant, is C6H12O6, okay? If we break this down, when we start to look at the carbon, that's CO2 that originates, that gives us that carbon molecule for our long-term energy. But when we start to talk about the hydrogen and oxygen, that comes from water. Okay? So even when we start to look at our fundamental building blocks, we're building plant material out of gas and water, and that's making a leaf that photosynthesizes and drives a battery forward. Okay? So when we come back, just fundamental aspects of watering. In the springtime, you've got a lot of evapotranspiration as trees are starting to grow, right? You've got this soft new leaf mass that's requiring an exponential amount of water to actually physically create that leaf mass. And you've got to maintain that gaseous exchange by keeping turgid pressure in those leaves so you can have that in and out, heat going out, oxygen going out, carbon dioxide coming in, creating this energy that allows that plant to continue to metabolize and build. This is a fundamental thing that you have to understand about spring watering to know that in the springtime, your plants will probably using more water now than at any other time of the season because they're having to use water for so many different functions, okay? I want you guys to take a quick look at this clip that we created. It'll just show kind of me going through the watering process and rapping with you guys a little bit. Have a look at this. When we come back, we're going to talk about foliar misting and how that functions into this whole system. But have a look at this, and we'll catch you with questions and start on that next topic when we come back. It gets so hot in here, and the humidity drops exponentially when it gets too hot. So part of the whole process of watering as we're moving trees out of the greenhouse, the trees that are in here may not be adapted or ready for full sun, or more than the sun is probably the wind. So we've got them in here, but just to come in and hose down the benches and raise the humidity. And when you start thinking about water, you almost have to think about water as a mechanism for air conditioning on all fronts, because ultimately that's how trees are using water. They're not thinking about thirst. They're thinking about how hot they are and how much they want to be cooling themselves. And water is such a transport mechanism, and they've also got to be thinking about maintaining turgidity in the cells in the leaves to be able to allow gaseous exchange. And this is another thing, you know, when we talk about like, okay, well, trees still need water in the wintertime, but it's cold in the wintertime. So if you're saying, you know, the majority of water that's used in a tree is used for cooling in the wintertime, why do we still have to water when it's super windy and frozen? Or how does freeze damage occur if you're only worried about cooling the plant? And this would be where now we start to talk about too, in order for a tree to photosynthesize, it has to be able to exchange gases through the stomata, or the openings in the needle mass at the tips of the branches. If you have wind removing too much water from that location, what ends up happening is via the loss of turgid pressure, right, or the loss of water, those cells have a mechanism where that loss of water, independent of what the tree wants, causes the stomata or that opening to close. And so in addition to, you know, cooling the tree via evaporation, there's also the necessity to maintain the ability to exchange gases and photosynthesize. And that also drives, right, via wind, the loss and movement of water. So there's two things that we've really got to think about. Now, as I'm in here doing this and I'm kind of wetting things down, I'm not really misting the foliage of the trees because the trees are transpiring via the foliage mass on their own. I don't need to be wetting that foliage mass. Maybe if I had a tree that I was worried was not going to survive the repotting process, I could supplement the water loss or reduce the water loss by momentarily putting moisture on the foliage and stopping that transpiration or loss of water. But for the most part, you want to keep water off the foliage mass and really motivate the water movement from the roots to the foliage mass and that transpiration that's taking place to be the driving force in the mechanism that stimulates that water movement. So during the spring, obviously our watering requirements are going to be significantly different because in addition to cooling, or in addition to maintaining hydration in the cells in the foliar mass to allow gaseous exchange, we also have the production of new photosynthetic surface area or foliar mass. And that takes a lot of resources because water is one of the big things that helps create the sugars and carbohydrates and the plant matter, the physical mass itself, by the hydrogen and oxygen in the water molecule that's broken up via the sun's energy through that photosynthetic process and then reaccumulated and reconstructed into sugars and carbohydrates, C6H12O6. And this is a very simplified discussion. So you have all of this fresh new tissue that's emerging that's using water to actually physically create itself. You have all of this fresh new tissue that's emerging that's using the stored sugars and carbohydrates accumulated over the fall season that also contributed to winter hardiness, but it very much is contributing to the tree's ability to generate a new foliage mass, okay? And then you also have all of this new tissue that has no cuticle, no waxy covering or barrier to prevent or reduce or cut down on moisture loss from the plant. So you're using water at an exponential rate in the spring season, particularly on a day like today. We're gonna hit 85 degrees today. This is the first 85-degree day, fresh new growth on everything. In fact, yesterday, even with the appropriate amount of water, some of our spruce got a little bit of sunburn, just the beginning of sunburn, because it was not at all ready. You know, the cuticle wasn't set up, hadn't seen that kind of sun or heat, wasn't at all ready for what happened yesterday. And we see this very commonly in the Pacific Northwest during the spring season. That first real significant warm spell that kind of tells the tree, oh, guess what? We're starting to get into a time of year where you're gonna need that cuticle. Stimulation of that cuticle's growth is almost directly associated with that trigger event of that first really warm period. Once you start spot watering, you really don't get to stop spot watering. And that's a really tough thing to understand, and it's a tough thing to combat because once you start spot watering, you water a little bit here, you water a little bit there, you come back 10 minutes later, another one's a little bit drier, you come back 10 minutes later, another one's a little bit drier, and it just creates this pattern where you're constantly having to check. So the way that I offset that when I start watering is I like to let things get a little bit drier, kind of uniformly throughout the garden. Right now it's about 10:30, 11 o'clock. I spot watered the things that I know absolutely need water in the morning. For example, the pygmy cypress forest because it's actively growing and it's on a stone. This guy's become a water hog. And you can tell it's going to be a water hog just by looking at it because you're starting to see these tips elongating. Anywhere you see these tips elongating in this rapid amount of growth, that's expanding the foliar mass, but also is very, very new, soft, bright, fleshy green. This is using water rapidly. It's also losing water rapidly. So using water to generate the tissue, losing water because there's no cuticle. As that new tissue expands, it can't have any obstruction from being able to elongate. Anytime you have that recipe where you're getting that good, strong, mature growth, you're seeing that really new, fresh tissue, you get a really warm day, humidity drops, you have any kind of wind, all of these things are factors that are going to increase the quantity of water you need to apply. Too many people think about watering in terms of how many times a day do I have to water? Well, That's not something that can be answered unless you know the exact temperature, conditions, state of the tree, size of the container, species of the tree, what happened last year, when was it last repotted, and on and on and on. Notice how I keep the water moving, and when I'm watering, really nice fine nozzle so that I deliver that water gently. I don't want to be moving that soil. I don't want to be blasting that soil away. The solidarity of that soil in terms of the technique and application of water, that stability is what we're looking for. It's the reason that we top dress. And that stability is what allows roots to occupy those areas of the soil mass. If you don't have that stability, if you don't have that soil mass concretely or at least firmly anchored with that top dressing and it's shifting around, roots will not occupy that location. They just simply won't. So that's a really important aspect of the repotting process. People talk about taking the moss off the surface of your soil and whatnot because it's bad for your tree. It's the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard. All right, so I hope that kind of helped you guys kind of walk with me through some of the processes of water. I find water to be absolutely fascinating, and watering was the very first thing, and I mean like literally the first thing I started learning when I began my apprenticeship with Mr. Kimura. All of the apprentices were gone. I walked into his garden. Nobody was there. He came out of the house. I didn't speak Japanese at the time. I'm like, "Ohayo gozaimasu," and he like walked by me, didn't even acknowledge me, and he just started watering. And I was watching him water, and the hose would kink, and he'd kind of look at me like, "Are you going to do something?" And I would unkink it, and then he would keep watering. And that became constant. When I learned how to water, it was just by watching that whole process happen. And then all of this science behind it kind of came as I progressed in watering, but more since coming back to the United States and starting to look at the trees in my garden, how they behave in my garden, and what the indicators are. Now, one of the things we didn't establish in the beginning, because I didn't want to dilute our understanding of water molecules and their movement through the plant, was what we're trying to accomplish in bonsai inside the container, which is a balance of water and oxygen, right? Because just having water is so important to cool, water is so important to keep gaseous exchange moving forward, water is so important to be creating that plant material, but we also need to understand that oxygen in the root system is equally as necessary, and that balance of the two is what maintains that healthy ecosystem in the container and allows all of that uptake to continue to take place. So whenever we're thinking about applying water, we've got to be considering that balance of water and oxygen. And this is one of the things that's not very frequently discussed when we start talking about the topic of misting or applying water to the foliage mass of the tree, okay? Now, when we start talking about misting, people say, do you mist? Do you apply water to the foliage mass of the tree? Not typically. Sometimes. Sometimes I'll apply water to the foliage mass of the tree. The question is, why? Why would you apply water to the foliage mass of the tree, okay? So I'm gonna ask you guys that. I don't necessarily want you to answer because I'm gonna keep rocking. We've got a lot of cool stuff to talk to you about tonight. But I do want you to answer that for yourselves right now. Why? Why would you apply water to the foliage mass of the tree? Okay? As you're thinking about that, we did have one question from the previous clip. Kendall, what was that question?
Yeah, well, first question is, what's the pH of our water?
pH of our water. pH of our water at Bonsai Mirai, pH is 6.5.
And then to follow up, Brian asked, our pH is 7.5. It's koi pond water. Should they worry about this? As
koi pond water? Is that?
He said their pH is 7.5, and then says in parentheses, koi pond water.
Oh, okay, like that's good for a koi pond. I don't know much about koi, so ideally when we start to talk about neutral, 6.5 to 7.0 is typically considered neutral. When we say pH is neutral in water, we're saying this is the point where that pH, that acidity or basic nature of the water, is at a neutrality that allows the most ionic concentration to move and be readily available inside of the water, right? So if you get too acidic, all of a sudden certain components no longer can maintain their no longer maintain their position in that solution. They start to drop out. They start to precipitate. Or if we get too basic, the same thing happens. They start to drop out. They start to precipitate. And this is why when we have very basic water, you start to see calcium deposits, because you're actually seeing the calcium precipitate out of the water at that pH. Now, what happens when that starts to occur is we start to see mineral deficiencies. And this is why when we have a very high pH, all of a sudden we start to see yellowing needles. Well, yellowing needles, or chlorosis, is generally a discussion of loss of nitrogen. But what happens at a higher pH is not that nitrogen starts dropping out of solution, but that iron starts dropping out of solution. And when iron starts dropping out of solution, you get iron deficiency, which disables the plant from being able to use that nitrogen to create chlorophyll and photosynthesize, and this is that process, okay? So pH is important. I want to come back to, what was the question about the flower buds?
Yeah. Aaron asked, he said, I've heard that a bud, he says, easy example is a flower bud which has no meristem. So he's heard that a bud contains all of the cells that will develop into a mature flower, and that the tiny cells just need to be inflated with water. Is this true? And then he commented, this makes me think about the energy required for bud set and emergence differently.
Yeah, interesting. So I've never actually heard that. I'm unaware of that information. If that is true, I've never actually studied that or learned that. Now, I do know that one of the 5 meristems on a plant is the flowering fruiting meristem that gives rise to cellular division that creates the flowering and the fruiting bodies. So I tend to think about that and wonder if that is in fact accurate. Based on the fact that there is a specific meristem, a meristem being where cellular division taking place, and cellular division being that catalyst for growth. Seems a little bit suspicious, but you never know. The plant world is full of all kinds of magical things, and you very well could be right, Aaron. I can't speak to that, though. But coming back to this concept of misting, why foliar mist? Now, at Bonsai Mirai, we try to keep moisture off of the foliage, because here we have the ideal conditions for fungal booms or fungal infection to take place if we're constantly applying moisture to the foliage mass. It allows the spores to germinate. It decreases the amount of oxygen exchange that's happening in the foliar mass, right? And it also continues to transport spores throughout the foliar mass so that you get a broader, wider spectrum of infection with these fungal organisms, okay? But there is a very specific time that we would mist, that we would use foliar misting to start to give that tree an advantageous stance. And that happens when we have this system and we no longer have a happy tree, right? Because something has happened that's decreasing, either decreasing the quantity, decreasing the speed, or completely impairing the ability for water to get from the roots up to the foliage mass. And this is particularly important for bonsai because we're so often manipulating that root mass that's taking in all of that moisture into the root system via that soil container and those soil particles. If we have damage to the root system via the repotting process, we can very easily impair this chain of movement. Now, we're also continually manipulating the branches and trunks. We're wiring, we're bending, we're raffia, we're splitting. All of these things start to happen, and we start to see the fact that we're impairing the movement of water in the quantity that's necessary from the roots to the foliage mass. So, when we start to get that situation, to come in and give this plant more or less a protective bubble around the plant that for a moment stops transpiration from taking place, for a moment stops gaseous exchange from taking place, for a moment halts the tension that's being placed on that chain in such great demand without the ability for it to continually move so smoothly. And a lot of times what happens when we just stop that process for a moment, we may be pulling so hard because there's a lack of ability for water to move that when we stop that process for a moment, we allow all of those water molecules to just catch up enough to maintain flow, movement, rehydrate that water content in the foliar mass on a cellular level before that water evaporates, and that whole process starts again. But if you're constantly foliar misting, you're also shutting down the photosynthetic process, right? And so you've got to be weighing these things continuously. Okay, I can get fungus, I can shut down photosynthesis, I've got a tree that's not functioning correctly, I can give it a little bit of a break from transpiration, right? We've got a clip prepared for you guys with a tree that suffered some very significant damage. We discussed the misting process. When we come back, we'll touch on a few more details, move forward with the watering, but take a look at this and enjoy. Now over on this pad right here, these trees are getting morning sun. This is where we keep a lot of our spruce, a lot of our Doug fir, keep our redwoods over here, trees that are coming out of the greenhouse from being repotted that we're acclimating. This is a great location to kind of make that transition because they're going to get morning sun and then they're going to actually start to get shade in about 30 minutes. You can see it creeping in from the chicken coop. So when it gets to be really hot, when we hit 85, this area over here will be in complete shade and be really, really nice. Lots of humidity from the surrounding trees, help protect from that intense heat. Now this spruce right here, the trunk broke in half. We just pulled it out of the greenhouse because the greenhouse is going to start to become extremely dry and hot. For a spruce, that's not favorable. So you notice I just missed that foliage. All I'm doing when I'm misting that foliage, the only thing I just did was I just stopped transpiration for a moment because I've covered the surface of that needle in a sheet of water. Gaseous exchange and the loss of that water molecule via transpiration has slowed down, and it allows the roots to transport that moisture up to that foliage mass to rehydrate it before that water evaporates, so that each time that I'm misting, I'm just kind of allowing the tree to catch up. Just allowing it to catch up, stopping transpiration for a moment, allowing everything to catch up, and then it starts transpiring again once that surface of mist that I just put on that foliage mass evaporates. So it's my firm conviction and belief that via that misting process, that spruce was able to survive a very major trunk split while we were bending that tree and styling it this spring. It continued to move forward very slow at first. We supplemented the loss of water a little bit with foliar misting, and we were able to reestablish that connectivity. It was able to generate enough tissue to get enough water to be able to push those buds. And that was a really fundamental time where I would use foliar misting. There are a few trees in the garden that have had some rough repots or the root system wasn't what we expected. We've been continuing to foliar mist those to help slow that loss for the moment, ease the tension on the chain, allow the cells to rehydrate, and then continue photosynthesizing. Now I want to go back. I started off with this concept of balance of water and oxygen when we talked about misting for a reason. Because one of the biggest downsides to misting is we're paying so much attention to the foliage mass that we stop focusing on the root system, where that balance of water and oxygen is imperative for root growth to take place and to take the place of foliar misting by reestablishing that chain. So when we start applying heavy water to the foliage mass here, right, all of that water has to go somewhere. And if all of that water is moving into that soil mass and we already have a system that isn't working very efficiently, then we start to accumulate too much water and not enough oxygen. And the foliar misting process actually does a disservice to the health of the tree. So as you guys are using these techniques, you've always got to be paying attention to all of the surroundings that are in occurrence as a result of your actions for that one singular thing, so that you're able to monitor all of those systems. And this is the single biggest weakness that I see in novice bonsai practitioners, is your peripheral vision of bonsai is not yet well honed because you're still focused on this technique so much. I saw it even today working on packing the trees and whatnot. There's just small things that we can be aware of. I know you guys have some questions. Kendall, what do we got?
Some questions about pH again.
Okay.
Gerald says he's in a desert Albuquerque range.
Okay.
7.2 to 8.3. 7.7 is the average. Should water be corrected?
Jeez. Yikes. Okay, what else do we have for pH? 7.7, 8.3, got
we
that?
have, someone has 7.5, wondering if that's too high.
7.5.
Someone's using city water 7.0 with fluoride and chlorine added, wondering if that's detrimental to the health of the tree.
Nice, nice. Okay, so the only way that you guys can know if it's detrimental to the tree is by looking at the tree. Is the tree giving you indications that it's detrimental? Do you have stunted growth? Do you have yellowing needles or purpling needles or browning needles? Do you have any kind of weakness, or do you have heavy deposits on your container? These are all things that would be indicators that you may need to take some action to correct the pH of your water, right? Now, there's a few different ways that we can correct pH in terms of adjusting and removing or reducing the pH, right? One, we can do an injection system. Okay, there's common, simple siphon injection systems. I know Mike Hagedorn has spent a lot of time on this. If you guys check out crataegus.com and Mike Hagedorn's blog, he talks about how he uses the simple product of vinegar to reduce the pH of his watering system. This requires calculation, this requires some steps to get that done, but that is one way that this can happen, okay? Number two, we call these RO systems, or reverse osmosis systems. Okay? Now, reverse osmosis means we're going to be removing all of the ionic concentration that's in that water and literally reduce it down to H2O. Okay? When we do this, what we don't realize about water that we're using is it's loaded with minerals, right? Here at Bonsai Mirai, if we leave water in a toilet bowl for 2 months, that toilet bowl will turn, a brilliant red color because we've got so much iron in our water. Now, when you just drink it and the well has been functioning, it's very clear. You would never know, right? But we have a super high iron content. Some of you guys have a lot of calcium. Some of you guys have a lot of magnesium. Some of you guys have a lot of fluoride. These are all different dissolved solutes inside of that water concentration. RO removes all of that. We use a reverse osmosis system. We probably need to add additional nutrition because we're losing any ionic concentration that was already there. So you've got to be aware of the nutritional factors now. But that is a solution to very, very low or poor quality water, okay? Number three, we can go with a much less aggressive, simple charcoal filter system, right? So simple charcoal filter systems mean you'd have a charcoal filter on the area where you're getting water out of whatever cistern or whatever component you're holding your water in. And charcoal has long been a great filtration process to remove toxins or to remove debris from water or from fluids in general, right? And if the first time that anybody suffers from alcohol poisoning or they ingest a poison in their stomach, the first thing that the paramedics do is they dump charcoal into their system, right? Because that starts to neutralize all of those toxins and components. So when we start to think about that, charcoal filters have been around for forever and continue to be a great solution. Now, I'm going to go back to the ultimate poor man's technique for improving your quality of water, particularly if you're on city water, and that is simply open air, off gas. Okay, and that is to say, when we start to look at chlorine, and in particular chlorine, in our city water systems, chlorine is a gas. So if we have city water and we're concerned about chlorine content, which is very toxic to plants in high quantities, it's also toxic to humans, so be careful, right? Very toxic to plants in high quantities. The simple practice of allowing your water to sit out in open air, leaving the lid off of a cistern, having your water basins that you're holding the water in before you use it to apply to your plants. These are very easy, cheap ways to be able to allow that chlorine and some of those other gases that could be polluting our water system or the water we're applying to our trees, allowing those things to dissipate before we go in and we utilize that water to give our trees what they need. Okay? We have any other questions we need to tackle?
So would you suggest anything outside of the range 6.5 to 7 you'd use one of these techniques on to adjust?
Again, I think when we start to talk about when do I need to address a water issue, when the water issue starts to cause a problem, right? And that is the fundamental fact of all things considered. And we'll talk about water application to offset some of these issues moving forward in one of the upcoming clips. But heavy, saturating water application is one of the best ways to reduce the amount of solutes that remain inside of the system, right? So you could have a high calcium water content. You water heavily, and a lot of that calcium is going to be continually removed from the system. If you're lightly watering constantly, if you're foliar misting just a little bit all the time, you're putting a little layer of water on that evaporates and leaves that ionic concentration or those dissolved solutes on the surface of the plant or container. That is a great way to start to cause that buildup to occur, right? But when we're deep flushing, that can reduce that. If you see problems, nutrient deficient signs, that means that the pH or your water quality is starting to impair the health of the tree. That's when I would encourage you guys to start diving into manipulating and improving the system. Maybe start out with some simple methods to see if it improves, and if it doesn't, you can go to more advanced methods which also become more costly, but also have a very high level of success, okay? All right, okay.
Greg has a question.
What do you got?
Greg was wondering if you can use your idea behind the misting via high humidity, like in a greenhouse.
Absolutely, absolutely, and we're just going there right now, okay? So we've been talking about the fact that during the spring season, we have a lot of transpiration taking place with raising temperatures and fresh new plant tissue that's losing water rapidly, okay? We want to maintain that gaseous exchange because that's what's allowing us to drive photosynthesis, right? We want to be removing heat. We want to be moving nutrition, water as a vehicle, okay? And we also talked about the fact that that fundamental aspect of the hydrogen and oxygen are what contribute to that fundamental carbohydrate and sugar that generates the energy to create that plant matter. Okay, those are all big concepts, but let's get down to what you guys really want to know. How do we know when to water? Right? How do we know when to water? That's great. You've just told me all about water. I understand now that water is used for these different things. I get it. Maybe my water sucks, maybe it doesn't. How do I actually know when to water? This is one of the fundamental things that is mispracticed in bonsai. I think watering is the most difficult thing that we do. Let's go into this from a different avenue than we typically enter watering, because I'm guessing if I asked you guys, how do you know when to water, you'd say when the soil is dry. I'm guessing, right? And if we had that conversation and that was your answer to me, I would say, oh, guys, come on, we got to go deeper. We got to dig deeper, right? Watering is too important to be able to say, soil's dry, I got to water, okay? Let's look at the mechanism that drives movement and back into this from there, okay? We're saying, listen, transpiration is what drives water, okay? So how do you increase the quantity of transpiration? Expand the foliage mass, right? Expand the foliage mass. So when I walk out into that garden, one of the funny things about being a professional is somebody will bring you a tree and they'll say, here, take care of my tree. Well, you don't know when that was repotted. You don't know what was done to it. You don't know what soil it's in. You don't know anything about that. They hand you your tree. How do I identify what's going to be using more water than what's not? First thing is how much surface area is transpiring. How big is that canopy of foliage mass? Because I know that's where water is being lost. So when I'm looking at how do we know when to water, or how do we know how to water, I always ask myself, how much foliage? How much foliage is on the tree, which means how much water is being lost, okay? So if we're looking at how much water is being lost, the next thing we've got to ask ourselves is how big is the reservoir that's supplying that water? How big is the container? How much water does it have to pull from, okay? So once we've looked at the foliage mass, we're saying it's losing a lot of water. Maybe it's losing very little water. Maybe it has a very small foliage mass in a big container. This is the most dangerous situation in the world. Also one of the reasons that I don't encourage people to slip pot into larger containers when the root mass is compromised, okay? But let's say we have a ton of foliage and we have a very tiny container, okay? That is a situation where that tree is going to be using a lot of water. Now we're going to say, what are the preferences and tolerances of the species? Are we dealing with a ponderosa pine or a Japanese white pine that can go 5 or 6 days without water? Are we dealing with a juniper that has very lush growth that needs a lot of water to supplement that? Are we dealing with a Japanese maple that if we don't have a consistent amount of moisture in the soil, we're going to see definitive burn or problems with the foliar mass? All of these things we have to take into account before we ever look at that soil mass and say it's dry or it's wet, okay? Because we've got to be looking at the system and understanding the system and knowing how this system works. So we're looking at the foliage mass, we're looking at the reservoir, the container, we're looking at the species and what it prefers and what it can tolerate, okay? And then we've got to be looking at those fundamental things of RH. What is the relative humidity? The question that was asked, what about a greenhouse where you have high humidity? High humidity means less evapotranspiration. And this is why in the summers in Japan, the trees used exponentially lower quantities of water. You get high humidity, you get high temperatures, trees shut down, that cooling system stops working as well, right? Like a swamp cooler down in a very humid environment does not cool the house nearly as well as a very dry environment. Okay, so we're looking at relative humidity, we're looking at sun exposure. Okay, we're looking at temperature. And we're looking at wind. These are all the environmental factors after we've been looking at the tree and saying, how much foliage does it have? How big or small is that container? What are the preferences and tolerances of the species? Is it a humid day or a dry day? Is it intense sun or is it cloudy? Is it hot or is it cool or is it cold? And is it windy? After we've looked at that, we look at the soil. We say this soil is moist, but this soil isn't dry, right? This soil is moist, but it isn't dry. Okay, it's moist. I'm not going to come back for 4 more hours. This tree has a robust canopy in a small container. I'm going to water it, right? This tree is moist. I'm around all day. It's got a small canopy and a large container. I better hold off. Because ultimately, the thing that we're striving to achieve is balance of water and oxygen. Balance of water and oxygen is what we're trying to achieve. So we've got to constantly be weighing all of these factors before we decide whether or not we're actually physically going to be watering. We prepared a clip for you guys that shows just a little bit of indicator in terms of water content in Akadama as a soil particle, how we see wet, how we see dry, right? Looking at the entire tree for canopy, container, all of these things, and then looking at that soil to say, this is dry, this is wet. So this tree was allowed to grow pretty free last year. It's got a very robust foliage mass. It's a Sierra juniper, which is a high water consumptive, maybe the most water consumptive juniper species that we have. And it's been in this container for almost 3 years. Hot day like this tree will probably be watering 2 times at least during the spring season. There's even a chance that if it's really rocking and rolling, we would have to come back for a 3rd. I don't think this tree has the foliage mass to warrant 3 waterings today, but we'll just have to see. We'll have to see what happens over the course of the next 6 to 8 hours that we have sunshine. And when we're talking about ponderosa, you know, a lot of people talk about starving ponderosa or cutting back on water in the spring and all that stuff. We kind of handle it the opposite. We try to give our ponderosa everything that they need. And what ends up happening is we get significantly better back budding. So we'll let these big, strong shoots run out, take a lot of the energy. There's much smaller shoots right here at the base. We can come back in and take that whole strong shoot out, take that whole tip off, and get back down to a very tight, compact tree very easily. Just another way, another deviation on how we handle growth and different characteristics. We'll come back to single flush long needle trees though. Notice when I pull that aside how moist and wet that is. See that dark color? The dark color is showing the Akadama is hydrated. You can see the beige color of the surface Akadama. Notice those beige pieces? That's dry. We see that dark brown color. That says that there's still a lot of moisture in it and it's wet, okay? So when I'm looking at this, we'll have to re-top dress this tree. This is a tree that we pulled back on the top dressing because it had such a minimal root mass last year and we wanted to really make sure we got good oxygen exchange. But I'm looking at this tree and my initial encouragement to inspect the moisture quantity in the soil was seeing that the foliar mass is not super large. There isn't an exhaustive amount of transpiration taking place even though there's new growth. And so I'm being very careful and detail oriented about the way that I water this tree, okay? And because of that watering, because of that detailed watering over the course of last year, we were able to get the tree to where it is right now, producing an immense amount of growth. So if we fertilize correctly, we continue to give it the balance of water and oxygen that it needs, this tree is only going to get healthier this year, and with the increase in foliar mass, the increase in water demand will also come with that.